Today I'm going to test out my very old art markers to see if they still work, and if they do, I'm gonna try to color some stuff with them. So I have a bunch of art markers that I have not touched in about 13 years. I've been making art almost exclusively in the digital space for ages, and it's time to change that. So let's see if these ancient art markers even still work. First, we're going to try these Prismacolor markers, which have been my go-to workhorses all through high school and college. I've had these markers for a long time, and while I have replaced a few of them, some of these markers are close to 20 years old. To test each marker, I'm going to swatch each of them on some heavy Bristol paper. Swatching is important to know how well the marker works, but also to know what color you're going to get after the marker dries. These markers are all alcohol-based and tend to look very different when they're wet as opposed to when they're dry. Typically, the color shown on the marker itself also doesn't really match too closely to the actual color, so swatching is really important. I'll be swatching the Prismacolor markers on one sheet and my other markers on a second sheet. This makes sense because the markers are sorted in two different bins, and once I'm done, I can keep the separate swatch sheets with the markers in their bins so I have a handy color reference for the future. Like most art markers, the Prismacolor markers have a different marker tip at each end, a broad tip and a fine tip. Prismacolor's fine tip is tiny and has never held ink very well, and as you can see by my swatches, they're pretty much unusable for the most part. But that said, I was pretty excited to see that most of the markers still work pretty well. A lot of them are obviously showing their age, and some take a few layers for full coverage, but given the sheer age of these markers, I am really impressed. You'd never know that they'd been sleeping in a drawer for at least 13 years after a long time of use before that. These Prismacolor markers hold a really special place in my heart. They've been dragged with me to all sorts of conventions to do commissions in Artist Alley, and followed me around in my various backpacks to make art on the go. And I had such a wave of nostalgia when I opened that first marker and smelled that distinctive, really strong alcoholic art marker smell. It's also a good reminder to use these markers in well-ventilated areas. Now that all of the Prismacolor markers are all swatched and they all still work, which is awesome, let's move on to the other brand that I have, which is the DeSerres brand of art markers. Now these markers have actually barely been used. They are, as well, at least 13 years old, but these were gifted to me by someone who realized they would never use them, and then I got them around the time I stopped using art markers, so they continued to go unused in one of my art bins. In addition to the DeSerres markers, I have 3 random Tria brand markers that I can only guess I bought when I ran out of the equivalent colors in the Prismacolor line at some point, and the Prisma line was sold out. So let's swatch these all out and see how they held up. Right out of the gate, I really like the fine tip on the DeSerres markers far better than the Prismacolor fine tip. The fine tip on the DeSerres is a bit thicker and holds ink way better. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the DeSerres markers layer down more smoothly than the Prismacolor markers as well. They're obviously a bit younger, and I haven't used them, so they probably have a lot more ink left in them. There are a lot of lighter colors in this batch and less bright or dark colors, which is useful to me since my favorite way to use art markers is in tandem with colored pencils to create a really rich, layered color effect, which I do hope to start doing again in some future videos. When I was younger, I used to swatch every marker at the front of each sketchbook because my sketchbooks sometimes had different paper types and I wanted the swatches to reflect the paper in that particular book. I remember it was pretty time consuming, but back then, all I had was time, I guess. Being an adult's rough. I'm really happy that so far I haven't had a single marker be dry. This is really impressive and also probably a good indicator that I put the caps on correctly the last time I used these. I remember learning the hard way how quickly these markers dry out if a cap is put on incorrectly. And with that, all of my colors are swatched, and it's time to try them on some actual art, which I was kind of nervous about, to be honest. Before I started filming this video, I doodled up a bunch of little creatures, robots, and things to give myself some really low-stress subjects to color. I sketched these out with a Colorase pencil and inked them with Sakura Micron pigment liners, as well as a Pitt artist pen for some of the thicker lines. It turns out I'm super out of practice with inking as well, but that's okay. It's all part of the process, and the pigment ink is fantastic for using with these markers because typically they won't bleed from the marker coming into contact with them. So I started out with this little robot and just focused on simple, solid color blocks to get a feel for the markers again. I'm trying to use all the marker brands I have in equal parts, but it's a little frustrating to use the Prismacolor markers since I can't use most of their fine tips. I tried a few times and every time it was a bad idea, so I just had to try and make it work for the broad tips. On the second creature, I wanted to try my old technique of applying the shadows first and then blending the main color on top. Unfortunately, I used jade green for the main color, which it turns out is in the midst of drying out, so it's not the cleanest coloring job, and I don't think I chose a really good shade color to go with the jade green, but given the limited scope of my options, it still turned out okay. For the little axolotl type creature, I wanted to try my hand at a white character. I used a light pink for some shade and 2 other shades of pink for the accents. It's a really simple one, and it's one of my favorites on this page. For the little shark creature, I picked a few different shades of blue and did some practicing with layered blending, starting with a mid-shade blue and then adding a lighter blue followed by a darker blue stripe pattern. If I did it again, I probably would have moved the mid-tone blue upwards a bit since the markings look kind of weird, but the colors blended nicely, and I even decided to add a little puddle of water around it. The last one was pretty simple, just another experiment with color blending, but this time using greens and a spotted pattern. I still wasn't feeling confident enough to try anything fancy, but I wanted to try some greens. And I'm pretty happy overall with this first round of experiments. It was nice to just let loose and try out a few styles on a few cute little creatures. And next I decided to tackle a slightly larger piece. This is a drawing of a goblin with some acorns that I drew a few weeks ago, and this drawing actually inspired me to make this video in the first place since I immediately thought, hey, I'd love to color this with markers, which spawned the question, are my markers even alive after all this time? So for this piece, I started with all the shadows for the most part, with the intent of blending them with the main colors later on, like I did with the jade green creature on the last piece. I used a lot of Prismacolor markers for this part since I have more dark colors in that brand, which meant I again had to contend with the big broad tip, which was difficult in a few spots, but I think it worked okay overall. I feel like I forgot all the theory I learned about how light falls on a character because these shadows are kind of all over the place. I was so focused on using the markers effectively that I kind of forgot about everything else, but whatever, we're learning here today, it's fine. Once the shadows are all laid down, I start grabbing my flat colors and coloring in, making sure to also color over top of my shadows so that all the colors blend together. Aside from accidentally hitting a few of her teeth with the green, oops, I'm pretty pleased with the outcome of this color job. It's making me excited to work with real media more often instead of all digital art because there's such a difference in feel when you're working with real materials on paper. Digital has come a long way and I really love it. There's so much you can do with it, but I think it's healthy as an artist to continue experimenting with traditional mediums as you grow. It helps to think outside the box and just continue to challenge yourself as you grow and improve in your craft. The yellow background was kind of a gross addition at the end. I'm not a big fan, but overall, otherwise, for my second other marker piece in a ridiculous amount of years, I am super happy with how this goblin turned out. I think these pieces turned out really well, all things considered. Clearly, I'm out of practice, but that was the point of this video, just to have some fun and get back into the swing of using art markers. I'm really looking forward to practicing more with markers again, and doing some more experiments using even more of my old traditional art tools. I had a lot of fun making this video, and if you liked it too, let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear your suggestions for future videos, or if you'd like to see more videos like this, and invite you to like and subscribe so you don't miss my future content. Thank you so much for watching today, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye!